What if I told you that the greatest crime in human history wasn't a murder, wasn't a war, but the loss of a single building? A building that held everything we knew, everything we'd discovered, everything we'd dreamed. Tonight, we're not talking about some dusty old library. We're talking about the moment humanity lost its memory. Forget what the movies showed you. Forget the image of one dramatic fire consuming centuries of wisdom in a single night. The truth is darker, stranger, and far more tragic than that. So, before we begin this journey into the shadows of the ancient world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely curious about the mysteries we're about to uncover. And I'm always fascinated to know, where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you're listening? Drop a comment below. I love knowing who's traveling through time with me tonight. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe pour yourself some tea. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we're going back 23 centuries to a city at the edge of the known world, where scholars dared to collect all human knowledge in one impossible place. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria, and the question that has haunted historians for 2,000 years. What really happened to it? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Dream of Alexander. Our story begins not with a library, but with a young man who believed he could conquer the world. His name was Alexander, and history would call him great. In 332 BC, Alexander stood on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, his armor still dusty from the long march across the desert. He was 24 years old. Behind him lay Persia, defeated. Before him stretched the vast unknown of Africa. But Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a dreamer. He had been tutored by Aristotle himself, the greatest philosopher of the age. While other generals thought only of land and gold, Alexander thought of something more precious: knowledge. He wanted to build a city that would outlast his empire, a city that would become the intellectual center of the world. The location he chose was perfect. A thin strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, cooled by northern winds, protected by natural harbors. The local fishing village was called Rakotis. Alexander renamed it after himself, Alexandria. He never lived to see it built. 4 years later, at 32, Alexander died in Babylon, his empire carved up by his generals like a feast among hungry wolves. But his dream, that survived. The man who inherited Egypt was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions. Ptolemy was a soldier, yes, but he was also something rare among warlords. He was literate. He understood that empires built on swords eventually rust and crumble, but empires built on ideas, those could last forever. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh, founding a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries. But his first act was pure genius. He kidnapped Alexander's body. The funeral procession was heading back to Macedonia when Ptolemy intercepted it. He brought Alexander's golden sarcophagus to Egypt, placing it in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. The message was clear. This city wasn't just named after Alexander. It was blessed by him, protected by him, legitimized by him. Alexandria grew with impossible speed. Greek architects designed wide boulevards that intersected at perfect right angles. The main street, the Canopic Way, stretched 4 miles long and was wide enough for 8 chariots to ride side by side. Ptolemy imported marble from Greece, granite from Aswan, and craftsmen from across the known world. Within decades, Alexandria became the jewel of the Mediterranean. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, rose over 400 feet into the sky, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Ships from every nation filled its harbors: Greek triremes, Phoenician merchants, Roman cargo vessels, Indian spice traders. But Ptolemy wanted more than wealth. He wanted something no other city possessed. The Greeks had Athens, birthplace of democracy and philosophy. The Persians had Persepolis with its ancient libraries. The Jews had Jerusalem with its sacred texts. What would Alexandria have? Ptolemy's answer was audacious. If Alexander had united the world by force, Alexandria would unite it by knowledge. Every book, every scroll, every fragment of human wisdom, from every civilization, in every language would be gathered here, translated, preserved, studied. It was an insane ambition. It was glorious. And somehow, against all logic, they were going to try. Ptolemy consulted with Demetrius of Phalerum, an exiled Athenian statesman and philosopher. Demetrius had governed Athens and knew the power of libraries. Together, they conceived of something unprecedented, not just a collection of scrolls, but an entire institution dedicated to learning. They would call it the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses. The 9 daughters of Zeus, who inspired all art, science, and literature, would have a home in Alexandria. And at the heart of this temple would be a library. Not a library as we imagine it today, with quiet reading rooms and whispered conversations. No, this would be a living, breathing organism. A place where scholars lived, ate, debated, and dreamed. Where the boundaries between nations, languages, and philosophies dissolved into pure curiosity. Ptolemy died in 283 BC, but his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, inherited his father's vision with even greater fervor. He would be the one to truly birth the Library of Alexandria, and he would do it with an obsession that bordered on madness. The stage was set. The city was built. The dream was crystallizing into stone and papyrus. In the sprawling complex being constructed in the royal quarter, something magnificent was taking shape. But a city needs more than marble columns and harbors filled with ships. It needs a soul, and Alexandria was about to get one. Chapter 2. The Birth of the Library. Imagine walking through the royal quarter of Alexandria in the year 270 BC. The sun reflects off white limestone buildings. The air smells of salt water, papyrus reeds, and the exotic spices being unloaded at the nearby docks. You turn a corner, and before you rises a complex so vast it takes your breath away. This is the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses. But calling it a temple doesn't do it justice. The Mausion was an entire university campus, a research institute, a botanical garden, a zoo, and yes, a library, all rolled into one impossible dream made real. The main building stood several stories tall, its facade decorated with columns in the Greek style. But this was no cold monument to the gods. This was a place designed for human brilliance to flourish. Inside, the complex sprawled across acres of carefully planned space. There were lecture halls where scholars debated mathematics and philosophy under painted ceilings. There were private study rooms where translators worked by lamplight, turning Hebrew poetry into Greek prose, or Egyptian medical texts into languages scholars could read. There were laboratories, though they wouldn't have called them that. Rooms filled with strange instruments, astrolabes for measuring the stars, water clocks for tracking time, dissection tables for studying anatomy. The smell of chemicals mixed with incense as proto-scientists conducted experiments that wouldn't be repeated for centuries. The gardens were legendary. Not just decorative spaces, but working collections. Trees and plants from across the known world. Syrian cedars, Indian spices, African aloes. Each one labelled, studied, catalogued. This was botany before the word existed. And then there was the zoo. Exotic animals gifted by foreign kings or captured on expeditions. Elephants from India, lions from Africa, strange birds with impossible colours. These weren't just curiosities, they were subjects of study. How do elephants breathe? Why do birds migrate? What can we learn about life itself by observing its strangest forms? Dining halls fed the scholars communally. They ate together, argued together, lived together. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a monastery of knowledge, where the religion was curiosity and the prayers were questions. But at the heart of everything, spreading through multiple buildings like a great mind organized into thoughts, was the library itself. There were actually 2 libraries, or perhaps one library with 2 souls. The great royal library stood within the palace complex, accessible only to the elite scholars, the kings, and their honored guests. This was where the most precious scrolls were kept, the originals, the rarities, the dangerous ideas. The daughter library, the Serapeum, stood in the public quarter of the city, attached to the great temple of Serapis, the Greco-Egyptian god who united Greek and Egyptian traditions. This library was more accessible, meant for students and educated citizens, though still magnificent beyond anything most cities could dream of possessing. Together, they formed an interconnected network of knowledge. A scroll might be copied in the royal library and sent to the Serapeum. A scholar might work in one building in the morning and the other in the afternoon. Ideas flowed between them like blood through a body. The architecture of the library itself was designed for scrolls, not books. Books as we know them, bound codices with pages, wouldn't become common for centuries. Ancient libraries stored scrolls, sheets of papyrus glued together and rolled around wooden rods. Imagine walls lined with pigeonholes, small square openings, each one holding a scroll. Some scrolls were short, a single poem or letter. Others stretched dozens of feet long, containing entire epics or scientific treatises. Each pigeonhole was labelled, categorized by subject and author. There were sections for poetry, subdivided by language and era, sections for mathematics, for medicine, for history, for geography. There were maps drawn on sheets of treated leather. There were astronomical charts. There were architectural plans. The catalogue itself was a marvel. A scholar named Callimachus created the Pinakes, the tablets, a comprehensive bibliography of the library's holdings. It ran to 120 volumes. 120 volumes just to list what was in the library. Each entry included the author's name, biography, and a summary of the work. This was the ancient world's Google, the first true search engine for human knowledge. The lighting was carefully designed. High windows let in sunlight, without exposing scrolls to direct rays that would fade the ink. At night, oil lamps burned in strategic locations, tended by silent slaves who replaced them before they could gutter out and risk fire. Fire. Always fire. It was the great terror of any ancient library. Papyrus burned easily, and once it burned, it was gone forever. No backup copies in the cloud. No way to simply reprint. Every precaution was taken. The library employed hundreds of people. Not just scholars, but scribes who copied scrolls day after day, their hands cramping over the same lines of text. Translators who knew 6, 8, 10 languages. Librarians who organized and reorganized the collections. Guards who watched the doors. Slaves who cleaned, who carried, who served. And presiding over it all was the chief librarian, a position of immense prestige. The first was Zenodotus of Ephesus, appointed by Ptolemy II. He was not just a keeper of books, but a scholar himself, a poet and grammarian who edited Homer's epics, creating the definitive versions that would be copied for centuries. Later, chief librarians would include Eratosthenes, who measured the circumference of the earth with stunning accuracy, Aristophanes of Byzantium, who invented the system of Greek accents still used today, Aristarchus of Samothrace, the greatest literary critic of antiquity. These weren't administrators pushing papers. They were the rock stars of the ancient intellectual world. But here's what made the library truly revolutionary. It wasn't just a passive repository. It was an active engine of creation. Scholars didn't just read scrolls. They compared different versions, corrected errors, wrote commentaries. They translated works from one language to another, making knowledge accessible across cultures. They conducted original research, performed experiments, wrote new works that would themselves become part of the collection. The Library of Alexandria wasn't a tomb for dead knowledge. It was a womb where new knowledge was born. Ptolemy II took his father's vision and amplified it with royal obsession. He declared that the library's mission was nothing less than the collection of all the books in the world. Not the best books, not the Greek books, all books. Every scroll, every tablet, every scrap of writing that existed anywhere. It was an impossible goal. A beautiful, magnificent, impossible goal. And they very nearly achieved it. But collecting the world's knowledge required methods that ranged from generous to ruthless, from scholarly to borderline piracy. The Ptolemies wanted every book, and they didn't much care how they got them. The great hunt was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Chapter 3. The Obsessive Collectors. The Ptolemies didn't just want books, they wanted every book, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get them. Ptolemy II issued a decree that would change the ancient world forever. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbours was subject to search, not for contraband, not for weapons, but for books. Imagine you're a merchant arriving from Athens, your hold filled with olive oil and wine. The harbour officials board your vessel. They're polite but firm. They ask if you're carrying any scrolls, any documents, any written materials at all. Letters from home, business records, a copy of Homer you read on long voyages. You hand them over, thinking you'll get them back after inspection. You're wrong. The officials carry your scrolls to the library. There, teams of trained scribes work with assembly line efficiency. They unroll each scroll, carefully copying every word onto fresh papyrus. The copies are made with remarkable accuracy, but they're still copies. Then comes the twist that reveals the Ptolemies' true character. The copies are returned to you, the ship owner. Beautiful copies, freshly inked, barely dry. The harbour master smiles and wishes you well on your journey. But the originals, those stay in Alexandria, forever. They were catalogued with a special notation. From the ships, it became a badge of honour, a mark of authenticity. These weren't scrolls purchased in markets or copied from other copies. These were real, living documents, seized from the flow of Mediterranean commerce. Some merchants protested. Most didn't dare. Alexandria was too important a port to risk being banned from. And besides, the Ptolemies paid well. Not as well as keeping your originals would have been worth, perhaps, but well enough to ease the sting. But ship confiscation was just the beginning. The Ptolemies had agents everywhere. In Athens, book dealers found themselves approached by well-dressed men with heavy purses. They bought entire collections at prices that made refusal nearly impossible. Rare works, common works, it didn't matter. If it was written down, Alexandria wanted it. In Pergamum, a rival kingdom in Asia Minor that was building its own library, Ptolemaic spies worked to acquire scrolls before their competitors could. This rivalry became so intense that Ptolemy V eventually banned the export of papyrus to Pergamum, hoping to cripple their library. The Pergamenes responded by inventing parchment, writing material made from animal skins. The word parchment comes from Pergamum itself. In Rome, still a rising power, Ptolemaic scholars purchased Latin texts that few Greeks could even read yet. History books, agricultural manuals, poetry. They were building a collection not just of the present, but for the future. From India came manuscripts on mathematics and philosophy, carried along trade routes by merchants who knew their intellectual cargo was as valuable as silk or spices. From Persia came astronomical texts, medical treatises, and poetry that made Greek scholars weep with its beauty even in translation. From Judea came something extraordinary. Ptolemy II wanted a copy of the Hebrew Torah, the sacred texts of the Jewish people, but he wanted it in Greek, the language of scholarship and power. The story, perhaps embellished but too perfect not to tell, goes like this. Ptolemy sent a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem, along with magnificent gifts. He requested 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to come to Alexandria and create a translation. The scholars arrived. They were housed in luxury on the island of Pharos, near the great lighthouse. And there, working separately according to legend, all 72 scholars produced identical translations. A miracle, proof of divine guidance. The more likely truth. They worked together, debating every word, every phrase, creating a translation that would preserve their sacred texts for a Greek-speaking world. This translation, the Septuagint, became one of the most influential books in history. It's the version of the Old Testament that early Christians would use that would shape Western civilization. But the Ptolemies weren't satisfied with buying and confiscating. Sometimes they simply stole. There's a story, recorded by the ancient writer Galen, about Ptolemy III and his dealing with Athens. Athens possessed the official state copies of the great tragedies. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These weren't just books, they were sacred relics, the original manuscripts from which all other copies descended. Athens, understandably, never let them leave the city. Ptolemy III asked to borrow them, just temporarily. He wanted to have copies made for Alexandria's library. To ensure their safe return, he offered a deposit, 15 talents of silver, an enormous sum equivalent to millions of dollars today. Athens, perhaps blinded by greed, or perhaps trusting in the astronomical size of the deposit, agreed. The scrolls were shipped to Alexandria with great ceremony. Ptolemaic scholars examined them with reverence, unrolling centuries-old papyrus with trembling hands. Scribes were commissioned to make the finest copies imaginable, using the best materials, the most careful handwriting. And then Ptolemy made his decision. He sent the copies back to Athens, and he kept the originals, the 15 talents. He forfeited them without a second thought. The price was nothing compared to what he'd gained. Athens howled in protest, but what could they do? March an army across the Mediterranean. The originals were gone, absorbed into Alexandria's ever-growing collection. The library's catalogue swelled. By the reign of Ptolemy III, estimates suggest it held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Some ancient sources claim even higher numbers. To put that in perspective, this was more than any other library in the ancient world by orders of magnitude. This was more books than most people could read in 10 lifetimes. But quantity alone doesn't capture what made Alexandria special. It was the diversity. Scrolls, in Greek, obviously, the lingua franca of scholarship, but also in Egyptian hieroglyphics and Demotic script, in Hebrew and Aramaic, in Latin, Persian, Sanskrit, and languages that have since vanished from human memory. The library didn't just collect Greek knowledge and call it universal. It genuinely tried to capture human knowledge in all its magnificent variety. Translation became an industry. Bilingual scholars were paid handsomely to render foreign texts into Greek. The work was painstaking. Ancient languages had no dictionaries, no grammar guides. Translators had to understand not just words, but contexts, metaphors, entire worldviews. An Egyptian medical text about mummification couldn't simply be translated word for word. The translator had to understand both Egyptian medicine and Greek medical terminology well enough to bridge two different ways of thinking about the human body. A Babylonian astronomical tablet recorded in cuneiform required someone who understood both ancient Mesopotamian mathematics and Greek geometry. The translator became a kind of cultural diplomat, negotiating between civilizations separated by centuries and thousands of miles. And all of it, every scroll, every translation, every acquisition, legal or otherwise, flowed into the library. The pigeonholes filled. New wings were added to accommodate the growth. The catalogue expanded until it required catalogues of its own. The scholars who worked there began to realize they had achieved something unprecedented. They had gathered, in one place, protected by one government, accessible to one community of researchers, something approaching the sum total of human knowledge. They had built a cathedral to the human mind, a monument to curiosity, a fortress against forgetting. They had no natural resources to guard it with, no army of copper or gold, just papyrus, ink, and an idea that perhaps, just perhaps, knowledge was worth protecting at any cost. But knowledge has always had enemies, and in the centuries to come, those enemies would gather like storm clouds on the horizon. For now, though, the library stood at the height of its glory. The shelves groaned with scrolls, the lecture halls rang with debate, and the greatest minds in the ancient world were about to walk through its doors. Chapter 4. The Golden Age. If you could travel back in time to any place in history, any single location where human genius reached its peak, you could do worse than choosing Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ. In the halls of the Mausion, something miraculous was happening. The greatest minds of the age gathered in one place, feeding off each other's brilliance, pushing the boundaries of what humanity thought possible. These weren't just bookworms. They were revolutionaries armed with scrolls and geometry. Walk with me through the library on an ordinary day. It's morning, and the Mediterranean sun slants through high windows, illuminating motes of dust that dance in the air. In one corner, a bearded man hunches over a scroll, muttering to himself. This is Euclid. You know his name even if you hated geometry in school. Euclid's Elements is one of the most influential books ever written. For 2,000 years, it was the textbook for learning mathematics. Even today, the geometry you learned, the proofs and theorems, most of them trace back to this man working in this library. But Euclid didn't invent everything in his Elements. What he did was more impressive. He gathered mathematical knowledge from across the Greek world, organized it, proved it rigorously, and presented it in a logical sequence that built from simple axioms to complex theorems. He created a system. In Alexandria's library, surrounded by mathematical texts from Babylon, Egypt, and Greece, Euclid had access to centuries of accumulated knowledge. He could compare different approaches, test different proofs, build on the work of dozens of predecessors. Without the library, the Elements as we know it couldn't have existed. In another room, a younger man studies maps and travel accounts. This is Eratosthenes, and he's about to measure the earth. Eratosthenes heard a curious fact. In the southern Egyptian city of Syene, modern-day Aswan, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun stood directly overhead. Vertical sticks, cast no shadow. The sun's light shone straight down into wells, illuminating the water at the bottom. But in Alexandria, several hundred miles north, sticks did cast shadows at noon on the same day. To most people, this was just a curious observation. To Eratosthenes, it was a key that could unlock the size of the world. He reasoned that if the earth was flat, the sun should be at the same angle everywhere at the same time. The fact that it wasn't meant the earth must be curved, and if he could measure the angle of the shadow in Alexandria and knew the distance to Syene, he could calculate the earth's circumference. He hired a man to pace off the distance between the two cities, 5,000 stadia, roughly 500 miles. He measured the shadow angle in Alexandria, about 7.2 degrees, or 1/50th of a circle. The math was simple. If 7.2 degrees of arc corresponded to 500 miles, then the full 360 degrees, the complete circumference of the Earth, must be about 25,000 miles. The actual circumference of Earth at the equator, 24,901 miles. He was off by less than 2%. Using nothing but shadows, geometry, and a man's paced-out footsteps. In the 3rd century BC, this wasn't just a party trick. It was a revolution in human understanding. The Earth wasn't a flat disk with edges you could fall off. It was a sphere, finite but vast, and knowable through reason and measurement. Eratosthenes later became chief librarian, where he created the first comprehensive map of the known world, complete with lines of latitude and longitude. He coined the term geography. Standing in Alexandria's library, he could see the whole world without ever leaving the building. But perhaps the most radical thinker to walk these halls was a man whose ideas were too revolutionary to be accepted for nearly 2,000 years. His name was Aristarchus of Samos. Every ancient culture believed the Earth stood still at the center of the universe, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars revolving around it. It made intuitive sense. The Earth felt stationary. The heavens clearly moved. Aristarchus looked at the same evidence and reached a different conclusion. What if, he proposed, the Earth wasn't the center? What if the Earth and other planets revolved around the sun? What if the Earth itself spun on its axis, creating the illusion of the heavens rotating around us? He was right. Completely, utterly right. 1,800 years before Copernicus, Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, but he couldn't prove it. The evidence available to ancient astronomy wasn't sufficient to demonstrate that the Earth moved, and the idea was so counterintuitive, so threatening to common sense and religious belief, that it was largely rejected. His work survived only in fragments, mentioned by other scholars who disagreed with him. If the library's fuller collection of his writings had survived, would the scientific revolution have happened a millennium earlier? We'll never know. Then there was Hero of Alexandria, an engineer and mathematician who invented things that seem impossible for his era. He created a steam engine, the aeolipile, a hollow sphere that spun when steam jetted from bent tubes attached to it. It was a toy, a demonstration piece, but it was a working steam engine 1700 years before the Industrial Revolution. He invented the first vending machine, dispensing holy water in temples when you inserted a coin. He created automatic doors that opened when a fire was lit on an altar, using heated air to move water that pulled ropes. He designed theatrical devices, military catapults, and a wind wheel that powered an organ. Hero's work was based on reading everything the library held about mechanics, pneumatics, and mathematics. He synthesized knowledge from multiple sources, adding his own innovations. His books became textbooks for engineers for centuries. In medicine, Alexandria became the center of anatomical study. The Ptolemies, unlike Greek cities, allowed human dissection. Doctors could actually look inside the human body, not just theorize about it from animal dissections and battlefield wounds. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in Alexandria, discovered that the brain, not the heart, was the center of intelligence. They distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. They described the heart's valves and understood blood circulation centuries before William Harvey. Herophilus measured the pulse, using a water clock to time it, turning diagnosis into a quantitative science. His anatomical texts became standard references for over 1,000 years. The library enabled all of this. Medical texts from Egypt, Greece, India, and Mesopotamia were available for comparison. Scholars could see what different traditions had discovered, test theories against each other, build comprehensive understanding from fragmented knowledge. In literature and textual criticism, the library's scholars essentially invented what we now call scholarly editing. Zenodotus, the first chief librarian, gathered multiple copies of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. He compared them line by line, noting variations, correcting what seemed like copying errors, marking passages that seemed like later additions. This might sound dry, but it was revolutionary. Before this, there was no concept of an authentic text. Every copy of every book was slightly different. Zenodotus tried to get back to what Homer actually wrote, establishing principles of textual criticism still used today. Callimachus, the scholar who created the Pinax catalogue, was also one of antiquity's greatest poets. His poetry was learned, dense with allusions to other works in the library. He wrote for an audience of fellow scholars who would catch his references. He pioneered a new kind of literature, poetry for intellectuals, art that required education to fully appreciate. Some criticized this as elitist. Callimachus supposedly replied, "A big book is a big evil." He favored short, perfect, polished works over sprawling epics. His aesthetic influenced Latin poetry and, through them, all of Western literature. The intellectual ferment in Alexandria created new fields of study: bibliography, the systematic description of books; philology, the study of language in written sources; critical editions; scholarly commentaries; research libraries as institutions; the PhD equivalent, where scholars studied under masters and produced original work. None of this existed before Alexandria. The library didn't just preserve knowledge. It created the modern concept of scholarship itself. And here's what made it truly special: the collaboration. Scholars from different cultures, speaking different languages, bringing different perspectives, working together. An Egyptian priest who could read hieroglyphics worked alongside a Greek mathematician. A Jewish translator debated philosophy with a Persian astronomer. Arguments erupted, certainly. Egos clashed. Academic rivalries could be vicious. But the work continued. The scrolls piled up. The catalogue expanded. The boundaries of human understanding pushed outward in every direction. For a brief, shining moment, humanity had built something extraordinary. A place where knowledge was valued above conquest, where questions mattered more than answers, where the diversity of human thought was celebrated rather than suppressed. It couldn't last forever. Nothing that beautiful ever does. But for a century, maybe two, The Library of Alexandria represented the highest aspirations of human civilization. Then the world began to change, and the forces that would eventually destroy the library were already gathering strength, though no one in those sunlit halls could see the shadows approaching. Chapter 5. The First Flames, Caesar's War. The library survived for centuries, but its vulnerability became apparent in the winter of 48 BC, when one of history's most famous men brought war to Alexandria's shores. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar wasn't supposed to be in Egypt. He was supposed to be chasing his rival, Pompey the Great, across the Mediterranean in Rome's brutal civil war. But Pompey made a fatal mistake. He fled to Egypt, expecting protection from the young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII. Ptolemy's advisors had a different idea. They murdered Pompey as he stepped onto the beach, cutting off his head and presenting it to Caesar as a gift when he arrived days later. Caesar, according to the ancient historians, wept, not because he loved Pompey, they'd been enemies, but because a Roman citizen, a consul, a general, had been murdered by foreigners. The insult to Roman dignity was intolerable. Caesar had arrived with only a small force, 3,200 legionaries and 800 cavalry, a tiny army by Roman standards. But he was Caesar, and he did what Caesar always did. He seized control. He marched into Alexandria and occupied the royal palace, declaring that he would arbitrate the dispute between Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife, Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra, though she was only 21 at the time, not yet the legendary figure she would become. The Alexandrians were outraged. A foreign general, a Roman, was occupying their palace, giving orders to their king. Riots erupted in the streets. The Egyptian army, 20,000 strong, surrounded the palace quarter. Caesar found himself trapped in hostile territory, massively outnumbered, with the Mediterranean at his back. What happened next would haunt historians forever. Caesar needed to prevent the Egyptian fleet from attacking his ships in the harbor. The Egyptian navy had dozens of warships that could cut off his escape route or bring in reinforcements for the besieging army. His solution was characteristically ruthless and effective. He ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet. The ships burned. The flames spread rapidly in the harbor, consuming vessel after vessel. The Egyptians watched in horror as their navy became a floating inferno. But fire, once started, doesn't politely stop when you want it to. The flames jumped from the ships to the docks, from the docks to the warehouses that lined the waterfront, and in those warehouses were scrolls. Thousands of them. The ancient sources disagree on the details, as they so often do. Some say it was 40,000 scrolls. Others say 400,000. The truth is, we'll never know exactly how many were destroyed that day in 48 BC. What we do know is this: the fire consumed a significant portion of scrolls that were meant for export or had recently arrived, stored in warehouses near the harbor, awaiting cataloguing and transfer to the library proper. Here's the crucial question that has divided historians for 2,000 years. Did the fire reach the royal library itself? The royal library stood in the palace quarter, the Bruchium, near where Caesar had set up his headquarters. Some ancient writers claim the flames reached it. Others say it survived intact. The archaeological evidence is inconclusive. The library's exact location within the palace complex has never been definitively identified. The most careful reading of the sources suggests this. The main royal library building probably survived Caesar's fire, but substantial collections of scrolls, whether in warehouses, in smaller reading rooms near the port, or in annexes of the library, were destroyed. It wasn't the apocalyptic destruction that popular imagination pictures. It wasn't Omar burning the library to heat bathhouses, a myth we'll address later. It wasn't Christians destroying pagan knowledge in righteous fury. It was war. Messy, chaotic, uncaring war. Caesar needed to survive, needed to neutralize a naval threat. The scrolls were collateral damage. Caesar himself never mentioned the library in his own account of the Alexandrine War. To him, it wasn't important enough to note. He burned some ships, some warehouses caught fire. He won the war. That's all that mattered to a Roman general. But imagine being one of the scholars in the Mausion, watching smoke rise from the harbour, hearing the reports that scrolls were burning, unique texts, irreplaceable copies, works that existed nowhere else in the world. Some sources say Caesar, perhaps feeling guilty, or perhaps trying to buy Cleopatra's favour, later sent scrolls from Pergamum to Alexandria, 200,000 of them, according to some accounts, though this number is probably exaggerated. It was a gesture, an attempt to replace what had been lost. But you can't truly replace what's been destroyed. Every scroll that burned in 48 BC was unique. Even if the same text existed in another copy, the specific manuscript had its own history. Maybe it had marginal notes from a scholar. Maybe it was a particular translation. Maybe it was the oldest surviving copy of a work. All that was gone. The fire of 48 BC didn't destroy the Library of Alexandria. The institution survived. Scholars continued working there. New scrolls were acquired. The catalogues were updated. The Mausion continued to function for centuries after Caesar left Egypt with Cleopatra on his arm. But something had changed. The library had been wounded. Its vulnerability had been exposed. It wasn't an eternal monument to knowledge, protected by its own cultural importance. It was papyrus and wood and ink, and all of those things burn. The psychological impact may have been greater than the physical damage. The library had represented permanence, the preservation of knowledge against the chaos of time. Now everyone knew it could be destroyed, not through some unimaginable catastrophe, but through the ordinary violence of political conflict. Caesar sailed away, eventually to be assassinated in Rome. Cleopatra would rule Egypt for another 2 decades before her own dramatic suicide. The library stood, diminished but surviving, still the greatest collection of knowledge in the world. But the first flames had been lit, and, in the centuries to come, more fires would follow. Some literal, some metaphorical, each one consuming more of what had been so painstakingly gathered. The dream of collecting all knowledge, of preserving it forever, had suffered its first great blow. The library would continue, but it would never quite recover the innocent confidence of its golden age. The question hanging over Alexandria now was not whether the library would be destroyed, but when and how completely. Chapter 6. The Slow Decline. The library didn't die in a day. It died the way most great things die, slowly, quietly, from 1,000 small cuts that nobody quite noticed until it was too late. After Caesar's fire, Alexandria recovered. The Ptolemaic dynasty continued for another generation. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, understood the value of the library. She patronized scholars, added to the collection, maintained the traditions, but when she died in 30 BC, Egypt died with her as an independent nation. Rome absorbed Egypt as a province. Not an ally, not a client kingdom. A province, ruled by a Roman prefect who answered directly to the emperor. Alexandria became a Roman city. At first, this seemed like good news for the library. Rome was wealthy, powerful, stable. Surely Roman patronage would protect and expand the great institution. But Rome had different priorities. The Ptolemies had poured vast resources into the library because it gave them legitimacy, prestige, and cultural authority. To the Romans, Alexandria was valuable for one thing above all: grain. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Its wheat fed Rome itself. The prefects who governed Egypt cared about tax collection, grain shipments, and preventing revolts. They didn't care about preserving ancient Mesopotamian astronomical texts. The funding began to dry up. Not all at once. No Roman emperor declared, "We're shutting down the library." It was subtler. Budgets were cut. Positions went unfilled when scholars died. Acquisitions slowed, then stopped. The great project of collecting all the world's knowledge simply became less of a priority. Scholars noticed. Letters from this period, preserved in fragments, speak of declining conditions, buildings in need of repair, sections of the collection becoming inaccessible, the sense that the golden age had passed. Then came the war that nobody remembers, but that may have struck the deadliest blow. In 270 AD, the Roman Emperor Aurelian faced a crisis. A breakaway state called the Palmyrene Empire, led by Queen Zenobia, had seized control of Egypt and much of the eastern Mediterranean. Aurelian marched to take it back. The fighting in Alexandria was brutal. House-to-house combat in the streets. The royal quarter, the Bruchium, where the main library stood, became a battlefield. When the smoke cleared, Aurelian had won. Egypt was back under Roman control. But the royal quarter was devastated. Archaeological evidence suggests massive destruction. Buildings burned, walls collapsed, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The sources from this period are frustratingly vague. No contemporary writer says explicitly, the library was destroyed in Aurelian's war. But they do say the Bruchium was laid waste. And the royal library, remember, stood in the Bruchium. After 270, references to the royal library simply stop appearing in ancient texts. Writers mention the Serapeum, the daughter library in the public quarter, but not the original, great royal library. The silence is deafening. Most modern historians believe this is when the main library died. Not in Caesar's fire, not in some mythical later conflagration, but here, in 270 AD, as collateral damage in a civil war that most people have never heard of. The Serapeum survived, and with it a substantial collection of scrolls. The tradition of scholarship in Alexandria continued. But the heart of the library, the royal library, with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, its lecture halls, its laboratories, was probably gone. But even if the main building was destroyed, the idea of the library persisted. Scholars still worked in Alexandria. The Serapeum still functioned. Smaller collections still existed, scattered throughout the city. What killed these remnants wasn't sudden destruction. It was neglect. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century was in crisis. It faced invasions, plagues, economic collapse, and an endless parade of soldier emperors who rarely lasted more than a few years. Resources that might have gone to maintaining libraries went to armies instead. Papyrus decays. In Egypt's dry climate, it can last for centuries, but only if it's stored properly. If buildings fall into disrepair, if roofs leak, if scrolls get damp, they rot. They become brittle, crumbling into dust at a touch. Without constant maintenance, without scholars constantly copying old scrolls onto fresh papyrus before the originals deteriorated beyond legibility, the collection would have slowly disappeared. It's possible that more knowledge was lost to decay in the 3rd and 4th centuries than was ever destroyed by fire. But decay doesn't make for dramatic stories. There's no villain, no moment of catastrophe, just time and entropy, patiently dismantling what humans had built. The economic pressures worsened. In 297, the Emperor Diocletian crushed a revolt in Alexandria. According to some sources, he ordered the destruction of books on alchemy and the transmutation of metals. Why? Because he feared rebels might actually create gold and use it to fund future uprisings. It sounds paranoid, almost comical. But it reveals a shift in how authorities viewed knowledge. The Ptolemies had seen knowledge as glorious, worth collecting at any cost. Roman emperors increasingly saw it as dangerous, something to control or eliminate. Scholars began to leave. Why stay in Alexandria when the resources were dwindling, when the intellectual community was shrinking, when the empire's new capital, Constantinople, offered better opportunities? The brain drain was subtle but devastating. Each scholar who left took knowledge with them, not just what they knew, but what they would have taught to the next generation. The transmission of knowledge requires teachers and students in continuous contact. Break that chain, and everything downstream is lost. By the early 4th century, Alexandria was still a great city, still wealthy, still important, but it was no longer the intellectual center of the world. That distinction had moved to Constantinople in the east and to Rome in the west. The library, or what remained of it, became less of a living institution and more of a monument to a vanished past. Scholars still visited, still consulted texts. But the great project, the audacious dream of collecting and preserving all human knowledge, was effectively dead. Nobody announced it. There was no funeral. It simply faded, the way dreams fade when you wake up slowly, not quite sure when sleep ended and waking began. But the final blow, the one that would destroy even the remnants, wasn't coming from neglect or decay. It was coming from something far more powerful and far more dangerous: religious certainty. The world was changing. A new faith was rising, one that would reshape the Roman Empire, and, with it, the fate of whatever remained of Alexandria's great library. Chapter 7. The Religious Wars. In the year 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine had a vision before a crucial battle. He saw a cross in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." He converted to Christianity, won the battle, and changed the world forever. Christianity had been a persecuted minority religion. Now, suddenly, it was the emperor's faith. Within decades, it would become the empire's official religion. Pagan temples, once glorious centers of worship, found themselves sidelined, defunded, and eventually banned. For Alexandria's remaining libraries, this was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The Mouseion, remember, was a temple of the Muses, a pagan institution. The Serapeum, the daughter library that had survived when the royal library fell, was attached to the Temple of Serapis, one of the most important pagan shrines in the empire. As Christianity gained power, tension increased. Christian bishops looked at these pagan temples filled with scrolls and saw not knowledge, but heresy. Ancient texts on philosophy, science, and religion that contradicted Christian doctrine. Dangerous ideas that could lead believers astray. The library had always been about asking questions. Christianity, at least in its 4th century institutional form, was about having answers. The two worldviews were fundamentally incompatible. In 391, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree. He banned all pagan worship throughout the empire. Temples were to be closed or converted to churches. Pagan festivals were forbidden. The old gods were dead, by imperial command. In Alexandria, this decree fell like a hammer. The Patriarch of Alexandria, the head of the Christian church in Egypt, was a man named Theophilus. He was intelligent, politically savvy, and absolutely convinced that paganism needed to be eradicated. When he received Theodosius's decree, he saw his opportunity. The Serapeum, that magnificent temple library complex, became his target. The sequence of events is disputed by ancient sources, with Christian and pagan writers giving very different accounts. But the basic outline is clear. Theophilus obtained imperial permission to convert the Serapeum into a church. When he arrived with a crowd of supporters, he publicly mocked the pagan idols, showing that the gods wouldn't strike him down for blasphemy. The pagans, including many scholars associated with the library, were outraged. They fortified themselves inside the Serapeum, preparing to defend it. Some sources say they took Christian prisoners. Others say they were simply protecting their sacred space. What followed was a siege. A Christian mob, led by Theophilus, surrounded the temple. The standoff lasted days. Eventually, the emperor sent word that the pagans would be pardoned if they surrendered, but the temple itself would be destroyed. The pagans emerged. And then, the destruction began. The great statue of Serapis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was torn down. The temple was stripped of its decorations, and the library within was destroyed. Christian sources celebrate this as a triumph over superstition. They describe monks joyfully tearing down idols, cleansing the space of demonic influence. They mention destroying pagan books without specifying what those books contained or how many there were. Pagan sources, fewer in number because the pagans lost, describe it as cultural vandalism, the destruction of centuries of accumulated knowledge, the burning of scrolls not because they were obscene or dangerous, but simply because they represented the wrong worldview. How much was actually lost in 391? We don't know. The Serapeum's collection was substantial, but it wasn't the full library of Alexandria. That had been declining for over a century. But whatever remained, whatever texts had survived Caesar and Aurelian and decay, much of it probably burned in 391. The destruction of the Serapeum sent a clear message. Pagan learning was no longer valued or protected. Scholars who had devoted their lives to studying ancient texts suddenly found their work not just irrelevant, but actively dangerous. But the most famous casualty of Alexandria's religious wars wasn't a building. It was a person. Her name was Hypatia, and she was perhaps the last great scholar of ancient Alexandria. Hypatia was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. She was the daughter of Theon, himself a distinguished mathematician who had worked on editions of Euclid and Ptolemy. She inherited his brilliance and surpassed it. In an age when women rarely received education, Hypatia lectured publicly on mathematics and philosophy. Students came from across the Mediterranean to study with her. She wrote commentaries on mathematical texts, contributed to astronomical observations, and taught Neoplatonic philosophy. She was also a pagan, or at least not Christian, in an increasingly Christian city. The Patriarch of Alexandria in her time was Cyril, nephew of Theophilus. Cyril was even more aggressively Christian than his uncle, determined to consolidate church power and eliminate all opposition. Hypatia was friends with Orestes, the Roman prefect of Egypt, who represented imperial authority. Cyril and Orestes were locked in a bitter power struggle over who truly controlled Alexandria. To Cyril, Hypatia represented everything he opposed: pagan philosophy, women in public life, secular authority, intellectual independence. In March of 415, as Hypatia was riding through Alexandria in her chariot, she was attacked by a Christian mob. They pulled her from the chariot, dragged her to a church, and murdered her. The accounts vary, but most agree that her death was brutal. Some say they used roof tiles to scrape the flesh from her bones. Her body was torn apart and burned. No one was ever punished. Cyril, if he didn't order the murder directly, certainly created the climate that made it possible. Later, he would be declared a saint. Hypatia's murder marks a symbolic ending point. She was the last head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, the last representative of that tradition of open inquiry that the library had fostered. After her death, the city's intellectual life never recovered. Pagan philosophy didn't die immediately. A few scholars continued working, though increasingly cautiously, but the trajectory was clear. The world that had built the library, that had valued knowledge for its own sake, was gone. The new world valued orthodoxy, faith, and obedience. Books that contradicted religious doctrine weren't treasures to be preserved. They were threats to be eliminated. In the centuries that followed, more was lost. Christian copyists, when they encountered pagan texts, had to decide whether to invest the time and resources to copy them onto fresh parchment. Works by Christian authors were copied. Works by pagans, unless they were too famous to ignore, like Homer or Plato, often weren't. The great chain of transmission broke. Texts that had survived for centuries simply weren't copied one final time before the last copy rotted away. It wasn't always deliberate destruction. Sometimes it was just indifference. But the effect was the same. By the year 500, the Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful sense, no longer existed. A few scholars still lived in the city. A few books still remained in private collections or church libraries. But the great institution, the Mausion, the systematic collection of all human knowledge, was gone. Christianity would eventually develop its own scholarly traditions, its own libraries and universities. Medieval monks would preserve texts that might otherwise have been lost. But that came later. In the 5th century, in Alexandria, the dominant mode was destruction, not preservation. The dream that the Ptolemies had built, that had survived for 7 centuries, was finally dead. Not killed in a single moment, but dismantled piece by piece, scroll by scroll, life by life. But there's one more myth we need to address. One final accusation of who destroyed the library. And this one, unlike the others, is almost certainly false. Chapter 8. The Arab Conquest Myth. In the year 642, a new power arrived in Egypt. The armies of Islam, sweeping out of Arabia, conquered Alexandria from the Byzantine Empire. The Arab general who led the conquest was named Amr ibn al-As. He was a brilliant military commander and one of the Prophet Muhammad's closest companions. According to a story that has been repeated for centuries, Amr found some remnants of the great library. He wrote to the Caliph Omar in Arabia, asking what should be done with the books. Omar, according to this tale, replied with cold logic, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree with the Quran, they are heretical. Either way, they should be burned." The story continues that the books were distributed to Alexandria's bathhouses, where they were burned as fuel to heat the water. There were so many scrolls, the story claims, that it took 6 months to burn them all. It's a dramatic tale. It's been cited by historians for centuries as the final destruction of the Library of Alexandria. It fits a narrative, the enlightened ancient world destroyed by religious fanatics. There's just one problem. It almost certainly never happened. The story first appears in the writings of a Christian bishop named Bar Hebraeus, writing in the 13th century, 600 years after the Arab conquest. 6 centuries of silence, with no contemporary sources mentioning this massive book burning, and then suddenly a detailed account appears. That alone should make us suspicious. But there's more. No Arab source from the 7th century mentions burning the library. The early Islamic historians who documented the conquest of Egypt in detail don't mention it. They talk about the siege, the negotiations, the terms of surrender. Not a word about books. The Byzantine historians who hated the Arab conquest and would have loved to record such an atrocity. They don't mention it either. For 600 years, nobody thought this story was worth recording. Then, during the Crusades, when Christian and Muslim relations were at their worst, suddenly it appeared. It has all the hallmarks of propaganda, a story invented to make the enemy look barbarous and destructive. But let's be generous. Let's imagine that some version of events actually occurred, that Amr did find some books, and that some were destroyed. By 642, there was no Library of Alexandria to destroy. The Serapeum had been destroyed in 391. The Royal Library had probably been destroyed in 270. What little remained had been scattered, lost, or deliberately destroyed by Christian authorities over the following centuries. The Arab conquerors couldn't have burned the Library of Alexandria for the same reason you can't shoot a corpse. It was already dead. In fact, the historical evidence suggests the opposite of the myth. The Arabs weren't destroyers of knowledge. They were preservers. In Baghdad, less than a century after the conquest of Alexandria, the Abbasid caliphs established the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah. It was deliberately modelled on the Library of Alexandria. Scholars were employed to translate Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, and hundreds of other ancient authors were translated and studied. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve these texts. They added to them, improving on Greek mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. When Europeans finally rediscovered Greek learning during the Renaissance, they often did so by translating Arabic translations back into Latin. The Arabs had kept the flame alive during Europe's dark ages. The myth of Omar burning the library serves a purpose. It allows us to point to a single villain, a single moment of catastrophe. It's simpler than the messy truth. The truth is that the library's destruction was death by 1,000 cuts. Budget cuts under Roman rule. Decay from neglect. Caesar's fire in 48 BC. Aurelian's war in 270. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391. Hypatia's murder in 415. The slow decline of pagan scholarship. The preference for copying Christian texts over pagan ones. No single group, no single religion, no single fire destroyed the Library of Alexandria. It was destroyed by time, by changing priorities, by wars, both religious and secular, by the simple fact that preserving knowledge requires constant effort, and that effort isn't always valued. Blaming the Arabs is historically inaccurate and conveniently absolves earlier cultures of responsibility. It's easier to blame foreign conquerors than to acknowledge that the Christian Roman Empire, the supposed heir to Greek civilization, presided over the loss of most of that civilization's written works. The real tragedy isn't that the library was burned. It's that it was forgotten. That generation after generation failed to see its value until it was too late to save it. The myth of Omar's burning is itself a kind of loss. It obscures the real history, replacing a complex story of cultural change and institutional decline with a simple tale of barbarism. And perhaps that's fitting, because the story of the Library of Alexandria has always been as much about myth as about reality, about what we wish had survived, what we imagine was lost, what we tell ourselves about the fragility of knowledge. The library is gone. Its scrolls are ashes or dust. But the dream it represented, the idea that human knowledge is worth preserving, that learning transcends borders and religions, that curiosity is a virtue, that dreams survived. In every library, in every archive, in every institution dedicated to preserving and sharing knowledge, the Library of Alexandria lives on, not as a place, but as an ideal, one that we're still, 2,000 years later, trying to achieve. Chapter 9. What was truly lost? The Library of Alexandria is gone. But what, exactly, did we lose? Not just in abstract terms, not just knowledge, but specifically, what texts, what ideas, what discoveries vanished with it? This is where the tragedy becomes personal, because we have lists, partial, incomplete, tantalizing lists of what once existed. Let's start with literature. The ancient playwright Sophocles wrote 123 plays. We have seven complete plays surviving out of 123. The rest are gone, most of them probably lost when the library declined. We know their titles. We have fragments, sometimes just a few lines quoted by later writers. Lovers of Achilles, The Shepherds, Tereus. Each title hints at stories we'll never know, characters we'll never meet, poetry we'll never hear. Euripides wrote 92 plays. We have 19. Aeschylus wrote, perhaps, 70 to 90 plays. We have 7. Imagine if we only had 7 of Shakespeare's plays. If Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, and most of the others had simply vanished. That's what happened to Greek drama. The loss extends beyond plays. The library held the complete works of hundreds of poets, whose names we know only from references in surviving texts. Callimachus himself, the great poet-librarian who created the catalogue, wrote dozens of works. We have 6 hymns and some epigrams. Everything else is gone. The Alexandrian poet Apollonius wrote the Argonautica, the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. It survived, but he wrote other works, now lost. How many other epics, love poems, satires, and songs burned or rotted away? In history, the loss is staggering. We have Herodotus and Thucydides, the foundational historians of Greece. But the library held the works of hundreds of other historians, each covering different events, different regions, different time periods. Manetho, an Egyptian priest, wrote a history of Egypt in Greek, organized by dynasty. We have fragments. The full work, which covered 3,000 years of Egyptian history, is gone. Our understanding of ancient Egypt would be transformed if we had Manetho's complete text. Berossus, a Babylonian priest, wrote a history of Mesopotamia, lost. Hundreds of local histories, biographies, and chronicles, each providing a window into the ancient world, gone. The loss of scientific texts may be the most consequential. We talked earlier about Aristarchus and his heliocentric model of the solar system. He was right, but he couldn't prove it with ancient technology. His full arguments, his calculations, his observations, all lost. We know about his theory only because other authors who disagreed with him mentioned it. How many other scientific insights disappeared? How many observations of the natural world? How many mathematical proofs? How many technological innovations? Hero of Alexandria's inventions seemed miraculous, but he was building on earlier work. The texts he referenced, the engineers who came before him, most of their work is lost. We have no idea what other mechanical marvels the ancient world had discovered and forgotten. In medicine, the loss is personal. Herophilus and Erasistratus, the anatomists who worked in Alexandria, made discoveries that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. They described the anatomy of the brain, understood the nervous system, studied the heart and lungs. Their complete works are lost. Medieval and Renaissance doctors had to rediscover anatomy from scratch, often making errors that ancient Alexandrian physicians had already corrected. How many people died because medical knowledge was lost? How many centuries of suffering could have been avoided? The library held medical texts from Egypt, Greece, India, and Mesopotamia, surgical techniques, drug formulas, diagnostic methods, public health practices, most of it gone. In mathematics, we're more fortunate. Mathematical ideas tend to get passed down because they're useful, but we still lost texts. We have Euclid's Elements, but other mathematical works from Alexandria survive only in fragments or not at all. Indian mathematicians had developed sophisticated number systems and algorithms. Some of this knowledge reached Alexandria. Some was translated. Almost all of those translations are lost. When Europeans finally learned Indian mathematics, it was through later Arab intermediaries, not from the original Alexandrian translations. In philosophy, the loss is profound. We have Plato and Aristotle because they were so famous that copies of their works existed everywhere. But countless other philosophers, developing different systems, asking different questions, are lost. The Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, the Cynics, these schools produced libraries of texts. We have fragments, summaries, quotations, but the full works of most of these thinkers are gone. How many alternative philosophies, different ways of thinking about ethics, metaphysics, and the good life died with the library? How many ideas that could inform modern philosophy were lost? And then there are the texts we don't even know about. The catalogue of the library, Callimachus's Pinaques, was 120 volumes long. The Pinaques itself is lost. We don't even have the complete list of what was in the library. There are probably works, entire genres perhaps, that we don't know existed. Scientific theories, religious texts, works of literature, also completely lost that we don't even know to mourn them. Ancient sources mention books on topics that sound fantastical to us. The Phoenician history of Philo of Byblos, claiming to preserve ancient Phoenician religious texts. The writings of Egyptian priests about their ancient knowledge. Were these legitimate historical sources or later fabrications? We'll never know, because they're gone. Maps are another devastating loss. The ancient world had sophisticated geography. Eratosthenes created a map of the known world, complete with latitude and longitude. Ptolemy, the astronomer, produced detailed maps and geographic coordinates for thousands of locations. Some of Ptolemy's work survived, but most ancient maps didn't. We don't know exactly how much the ancients knew about Africa, Asia, the Atlantic. Did they have knowledge of lands that wouldn't be discovered by Europeans until much later? There are tantalizing hints. Ancient texts mention trade with distant lands, ships that sailed beyond the known world, explorers who claimed to have circumnavigated Africa. How much was legend and how much was real? The evidence was in the library. The technological loss is hard to quantify. The ancient world had sophisticated engineering, Roman concrete that lasted millennia, Greek fire, a naval weapon so effective its formula was a state secret, Damascus steel, with properties modern metallurgy struggles to reproduce. Were the secrets of these technologies in the library? Probably. Along with countless other techniques and innovations, the personal loss is what haunts me most. Every scroll represented someone's life work. An author who spent years researching, writing, revising. A scribe who carefully copied the text, preserving it for the next generation. A librarian who catalogued it, ensuring it could be found. All that effort, all that care, all that hope that the work would last, gone. Think about the scholars in Alexandria who watched their world decline, who saw funding cut, who watched scrolls decay, who knew that the texts they studied might not survive another generation. Some tried to save what they could. They made personal copies. They memorized important passages. They condensed large works into shorter summaries, hoping that at least the ideas would survive even if the full texts didn't. But it wasn't enough. Most of it was still lost. The Renaissance, that great flowering of European culture, was largely based on rediscovering ancient texts. A copy of Lucretius found in a monastery, Plato's works translated from Arabic, Euclid's Elements brought from Byzantium. Each rediscovery sparked new ideas, new movements, new understandings. The printing press ensured these texts would never be lost again. But imagine if all those texts had survived. If the Library of Alexandria had been preserved, protected, maintained. If instead of rediscovering fragments, Renaissance scholars had access to the full corpus of ancient knowledge. Would the scientific revolution have happened earlier? Would medical advances have come centuries sooner? Would we understand the ancient world better, and through it, understand ourselves? We can't know, and that's the tragedy. We don't just mourn what was lost, we mourn what might have been. The books never written because earlier works were lost. The discoveries never made because previous insights had vanished. The Library of Alexandria was humanity's memory, and we lost it. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that we're still, 2,000 years later, dealing with the consequences. Every time a historian says, "We don't know what the ancient world thought about this," there's a good chance the answer was in Alexandria. Every time we struggle to understand an ancient text because we're missing context, that context was probably in the library. Every time we wonder what might have been possible if only humans had held on to what they once knew, we're mourning Alexandria. The greatest tragedy isn't just that the library was destroyed, it's that we destroyed it ourselves. Through neglect, through war, through caring about other things more than knowledge, through failing to protect what we couldn't replace. And the worst part, we're still doing it. Chapter 10. The Legacy and Lessons. The story of the Library of Alexandria should have a happy ending. After all, we learned from our mistakes, right? We built new libraries, better protected, more widely distributed. Knowledge is safer now than ever before. Except, is it? In 2002, the Egyptian government, with support from UNESCO and countries around the world, opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the Library of Alexandria reborn. It's a stunning modern building on the Mediterranean coast, not far from where the ancient library probably stood. It holds millions of books. It has digital archives, museums, and research centers. It's a statement that the dream of Alexandria, the dream of collecting and preserving human knowledge, is still alive. But it's also a reminder of what we lost, because no matter how impressive the new library is, it can't contain what the old one held. Those texts are gone forever. The new library is an homage, a memorial, not a restoration. And even our modern methods of preservation are more fragile than we like to admit. In the digital age, we assume knowledge is safe. Everything's backed up, multiple copies, distributed servers. How could we possibly lose information the way the ancients did? But we're already losing it. Digital formats become obsolete. Files become unreadable. Websites disappear. The early internet, just 30 years old, is already full of dead links, lost content, vanished archives. In 2023, a fire at a data center in France destroyed millions of websites. In 2018, Brazil's National Museum burned, destroying 20 million artifacts and documents. In 2015, the Library of Mosul was destroyed by ISIS, burning thousands of rare manuscripts. The Internet Archive, our closest modern equivalent to the Library of Alexandria, suffers attacks constantly. In 2024, hackers targeted it, briefly taking it offline. What if the attack had been worse? What if, instead of temporary disruption, they'd destroyed the archives? We're one solar flare, one electromagnetic pulse, one coordinated attack away from losing vast swaths of digital information. And it's not just accidents and disasters we should worry about. It's deliberate destruction. Book banning is experiencing a resurgence in many countries. School libraries are being purged of books deemed inappropriate. Public libraries face budget cuts and closure. The instinct to control information, to limit what people can read, is as strong now as it was when Christians destroyed the Serapeum. We like to think we're more enlightened than our ancestors. But are we? When we ban books, when we defund libraries, when we prioritize short-term political goals over long-term preservation of knowledge, we're repeating their mistakes. The Library of Alexandria fell partly because people stopped valuing it. Funding was cut, Positions were eliminated. Maintenance was deferred. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deadly. How many modern libraries, archives, and museums are in the same position? Chronically underfunded, struggling to maintain collections, unable to digitize materials before they decay. The knowledge is there, but we're not protecting it. And one day, we'll look back and wonder how we let it slip away. But there's hope too. Real hope. Not just wishful thinking. We're getting better at preservation. The Long Now Foundation is building a clock designed to run for 10,000 years, a statement that we can think long-term. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault preserves genetic diversity against catastrophe. Digital archives are being built with redundancy and distributed storage, and we're recovering lost knowledge in ways the ancients couldn't have imagined. The Herculaneum scrolls, carbonized by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, were thought unreadable for centuries. Now, using X-ray technology and artificial intelligence, we're reading them without unrolling them. The Archimedes palimpsest, a medieval manuscript that had been scraped clean and overwritten, has been read using multispectral imaging, revealing lost works by Archimedes underneath. Ancient sites being excavated with ground-penetrating radar might reveal libraries we didn't know existed. DNA analysis is revealing information encoded in ancient parchment itself, not just the words written on it. There's a chance, a real chance, that we might recover some of what was lost. Not all of it, probably not even most of it, but more than we thought possible. And we're creating new knowledge at a staggering rate. More scientific papers are published each year than existed in the entire ancient world. More books, more art, more data than the Library of Alexandria could have dreamed of holding. The question is whether we'll preserve it, whether we'll protect it, whether we'll value knowledge enough to keep it safe not just for ourselves, but for future generations. The lesson of Alexandria isn't just that we lost something precious. It's that preservation is an active process. It requires effort, resources, and commitment. Every generation has to choose to value knowledge, to protect it, to pass it on. The Library of Alexandria died because too many people stopped making that choice. They chose immediate concerns over long-term preservation. They chose orthodoxy over inquiry. They chose their own certainties over the questions of others. We face the same choices today. Do we fund libraries or cut their budgets? Do we preserve diverse viewpoints or suppress ideas we disagree with? Do we invest in long-term digital preservation or assume someone else will handle it? The Library of Alexandria is a warning, but it's also an inspiration, because even though it fell, even though most of its contents were lost, it achieved something remarkable. For centuries, it protected human knowledge. It enabled discoveries that shaped our world. It proved that different cultures, different languages, different ways of thinking could coexist and enrich each other. That dream, that vision of a place where all knowledge is welcome, where curiosity is celebrated, where questions matter more than answers, that dream didn't die with the library. It lives on every time someone opens a book, visits a library, asks a question, or seeks to understand something new. It lives on in every institution dedicated to preserving and sharing knowledge. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the idea of Alexandria is immortal. We are its heirs. Every person who values knowledge, who seeks truth, who believes that understanding the world is worth the effort, carries a piece of Alexandria within them. The scrolls burned, the buildings crumbled, the scholars died, but the dream endures. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of all. Not what was preserved, but what was inspired. The Library of Alexandria taught us what we could achieve when we commit to knowledge, and it taught us what we lose when we fail to protect it. 2,000 years later, we're still learning those lessons, still building libraries, still gathering knowledge, still fighting against those who would destroy or suppress it. The Library of Alexandria fell, but every time we open a new library, digitize an old manuscript, or make knowledge freely accessible, we're rebuilding it. Not in one place, but everywhere. Not in one collection, but in millions. Not as a monument to the past, but as a living commitment to the future. The dream of the library was always impossible. to collect all knowledge, to preserve it forever, to make it accessible to everyone. It was beautiful, ambitious, and doomed. But just because we can't achieve it perfectly doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The attempt itself, the commitment to knowledge over ignorance, to preservation over destruction, to questions over certainty, that's what matters. The Library of Alexandria is gone. Long live the Library of Alexandria. And so our journey through the shadows of history comes to an end. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed in a day, in a year, or even in a century. It died slowly, from 1,000 different causes, some dramatic, but most mundane. Fire and war, yes, but also neglect, budget cuts, changing priorities, and the simple fact that preserving knowledge requires effort that isn't always valued. We lost something irreplaceable. Works of literature, science, philosophy, and history that could have transformed our understanding of the world. Ideas that might have sparked earlier scientific revolutions, prevented centuries of suffering, or simply enriched our culture in ways we can't imagine. But we also gained something: a story, a warning, and an inspiration. The Library of Alexandria reminds us that knowledge is fragile, that it must be actively protected, and that the choice to preserve or destroy is one every generation must make. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the scholars of Alexandria, walking through marble halls lined with scrolls, debating in sun-drenched gardens, discovering truths about the universe that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. They built something beautiful. They dreamed something impossible. And even though they failed, even though the library fell, the dream itself survived. It survives in every library, every archive, every person who believes that knowledge matters. Thank you for journeying with me tonight through the lost halls of Alexandria. Until our next exploration into the mysteries of history, sleep well.